Hi everyone, Dan Gunner from Insane Forensics. Welcome back to Tech Talk Tuesday, where every week we try to give something to help your threat hunting and security program. And today we're going to talk about another recent intrusion called Volt Typhoon. This was a living on the land style attack that went against critical infrastructure. There were two main reports that came out, one by Microsoft, one by the government, by CISA, both in the US, New Zealand, Australia, the Brit side. Everyone released report on this state-sponsored attacker using living on the land techniques to go against critical infrastructure. So let's hop right into it. So back in May, so about 6 months ago, Microsoft released a blog titled Volt Typhoon Targets Critical Infrastructure. It's the one you see here. On that same day, CISA released an advisory along with FBI, the Australian Cybersecurity Center, and the other groups we mentioned, also titled People's Republic of China state-sponsored cyber attacker living off the land to evade detection. When we jump into the details of this, from this, what's said in the reports is this group's active since at least mid-2021. And it's hard to know, right, entirely when it started, exactly when it started. But based on what was provided in the reports, we know this went on for at least a year for the if not much, much longer, right? With living on the land style attacks, these are often harder to see, especially if you don't know or see the addition or the initial compromise, right? Industries that it targeted, you can see it's quite a bit. Everything from communications to manufacturing to maritime to IT to the utility side. This was seen both in Guam and the United States, at least according to reporting, but it's important to note that living on the land style attacks are starting to be used more and more, or actually they're starting to get talked about more and more. You look at like some of the sandworm attacks in Ukraine. I think one that was announced a few weeks ago entirely used living on the land. So, these techniques are not new, and they're not new against critical infrastructure. For this, the speculated intent was probably espionage and initial access, right? So this was an attacker that was trying to get on, keep access if they needed it in the future, spy, steal intellectual property, that type of deal. So when we talk initial access, what's interesting in these reports is there's not a whole lot of detail, but there's some interesting kind of tidbits in the report. So one mentioned internet-facing management portal on small office and home office network devices. These are your things like your home routers, your home networking gear, some of your home firewalls, right? ASUS, Cisco, D-Link, Nextgear. But another interesting one was Fortinet FortiGuard in here. And what's interesting, this action was believed to be done in the interests of groups loyal to China. Well, if we look at CISA reports, if we look at NSA advisories over the last few years, there's been a lot of usage of kind of the Fortinet, the other security appliance, public-facing things by these groups or by groups that are loyal to this country. So again, there's kind of this mix of like, hey, you have to watch what's exposed out because attackers might use a CV against it. They might use another way they know to bypass this. But one known way of initial access was through these network devices, right? At least mentioned through there. Once they, and again, they didn't disclose entirely the Fortinet FortiGuard. They didn't say, hey, it was this CV, they use this. But again, like something I would do if you're working through this is definitely go back through some of the advisory that CISA has done over the last 2-3 years on Chinese loyal groups on what they're using against devices. They use a ton of CVs. There's a ton of CVs you should look for depending on the vendor you have out there. What the attackers then did is they used a tool called Earthworm to tunnel data. This is a proxy tunnel type deal. You can see we pulled the website there on the left. This attacker, if you look at that website, what's interesting, or not this attacker, this developer, if you look at this developer's website now for Earthworm, they actually do publish out YARA rules. It was interesting. I didn't see this in the report. Maybe I just didn't look at that section too much. But when you're digging into this, like knowing, hey, tools like Earthworm, there are other groups using Earthworm too. If you go to the MITRE attack page, I think there's one other group mentioned using Earthworm. So again, this is a good YARA rule to say, hey, can I detect earthworm moving into my network? Can I detect it on a host if I need to? Because earthworm was the tunnel that was used outward on this. So that initial access, right, that's less living on the land and more like, hey, here's some ways that they might have gotten in. When we get into living on the land binaries or law bins, what this is using built-in functionality of Windows, basically for doing what the attacker needs to do. The advantage with this is from the security product perspective, a lot of security products aren't tuned to this level, right? Because these are normal expected programs. The attacker's just calling them in slightly different ways, in slightly anomalous ways that are different than the intended use. But by all means, these are legitimate programs. And like some of the ones we'll see, you can't just go delete comm services DLL from your Windows machine. That's not going to go well for a lot of your applications, right? And so when we look at credential access initially, one of the interesting parts of the report that we look at is they had an obfuscated PowerShell command. So if you look on the left there, they use command.exe to call PowerShell with a base 64 encoded payload. That base 64 encoded payload at the bottom called run DLL, which called comm services, which did a memory dump. And with this memory dump, right, they were actually, with the memory dump, what they're pulling down is the credential database. So then they can take it to password cracking tool and figure out what's going on. Again, on here, not a lot of malware used in the campaign. These are legitimate things. It's legitimately used for inter-process communications, for some system services. But again, they're able to dump memory to then pull that back and use a password tool basically to extract and dump passwords for later phases. Again, it's 5 chained Windows commands. There are ways to detect this. We'll talk more as we get into the host log section. But again, if you're looking at what is a log bin just looks like this on the system. And so when we go into the Windows event logs, right, this is the type of stuff we're going to look for. And this is the type of stuff too, to where you're like, hey, how is run DLL called? How often is run DLL called, on comm services DLL to dump memory into the temp file, right? There's a lot of things we can do, whether you're manually doing this in a threat hunt or incident response case, or whether, you're applying automation like we do to try to pull these out. A second way they dumped credentials was using WMIC. They did a process called create for NDTS util to dump the NDTS database. What this basically does, funny enough, so the fun command on this is another built-in Windows feature in there. NDTS util can actually create full backup installation media, and it includes the domain controller's ndts.dit database, which we actually did another Tech Talk Tuesday on. I think if you search ndts.dit on Insane Forensics, you'll find a Tech Talk Tuesday where we dive deeper into this. But again, that database is where the domain controller actually stores your usernames and passwords. And so what they're doing with this is, again, using a built-in feature to create installation media that then they can pull that password out of and dump it down. Again, when we're looking at this, right, it's another chain of commands. And again, what makes this interesting, using WMIC to call a process, there are artifacts in here that we can see that we'll talk about here in a few slides. But again, second way that was highlighted on how they were dumping passwords. This works in industrial settings, right? A lot of your industrial networks do have Windows systems, do have domain controllers. And so whether you're looking at this in the plant and, if you're at a refinery with like a Honeywell Experion communities, right, to where each community might have its own domain controller, this is something you want to look at community to community within a plant or within that Honeywell Experion environment to see, hey, am I seeing this on someone trying to collect credentials in this part of my plant, right? So when we get into post-compromised credential access, right, a big question that we're going to kind of turn back on you now is, how are you incorporating command line introspection into your efforts, right? Because these commands, while they're built-in commands, the good thing is they are actually logging into Windows event logs. One of the event logs we'll see is the Windows process creation ones. We did a Tech Talk Tuesday again on that, on using creation and termination events. This is an event log, though, that's not on by default. So you'll want to make sure you go in and actually enable these events if you expect to get them. The good thing is Windows actually generates these or has the capability to generate these by default. So if you do a group policy push, I'd recommend pushing this out, because once you turn on these that deeper line command processing, you'll get the process creation and termination events. There's still potentially other ways to see this, so like through the PowerShell event logs and other things we'll talk through. But again, like something to be mindful of is this is something that's hard to see in passive network monitoring, but you can see it on the host data when you dig into there. So, what level of logs are you collecting if you're concerned about Volt Typhoon, right? Because as we saw 2 ways they were collecting credentials. There's pretty easy ways to kind of see those, or pretty straightforward ways to see those, right? If you need some ideas, check out the Tech Talk Tuesday. We'll also talk in a few slides as we dive deeper into the event logs. Once we get past credential gathering and we get into the traffic proxy, again, they're using WMIC to call a cmd.exe to set up a proxy with certain things, right? Again, a remote WMIC call with credentials. It's important in here, right? Because this will drive what logs are actually generated out of this. So on the network side, or on the host side, right, that WMIC call is going to have some stuff. On the network side, the traffic type that's generated out of this is going to depend on what's going through the proxy, but there's still opportunities to see this on the network side, right? So some of the ways to detect this, so 4688, command line usage, this is that process creation. You could also look at 4689 for process ends. What's nice with that event log is it actually does have the command line, so you'll see the whole command line, right? Some of it might be obfuscated, like if you look at the PowerShell one with that base 64 side, so you might have to do a little work to pull that out or rely on some scripting to do that. That's what we actually do in our engine. We'll pull it through, actually deobfuscate and try to see through there, right? But you get that whole command line to say, hey, I can now go across all the command lines on the system and say, what is normal? What isn't normal? What do I need to look at? Hey, this looks a lot like the Volt Typhoon example, right? The other thing, this traffic, when you're setting up this proxy, it's going to result in a change of the network baseline, right? You're going to have a new server port bound on the machine that's the proxy server, right? Or if you're on the client side, right, you're going to have a client that's connecting to a weird port on a server, maybe inside your plant, maybe in another setting, maybe in a network zone you don't expect, right? So unexplained, network baseline changes in there from weird hosts. This is where host and network data is going to be helpful, because you might see it on the network and then the host data might say, oh yeah, it's coming from a really weird process, and I track that back to this command line and see something really weird's going on. Again, how WMIC's called, when we get into 4672 and 4648, 4672 is if they're logging in with an administrator level account, you're going to get a 4672 log for the special privileges for that new login. I think that's one enabled by default, actually. I might be wrong. Correct me if I'm wrong down in comments there, right? But again, if they're calling WMIC on a privileged account, you're going to have some breadcrumbs in that 4672 event. If we go to 4648, again, login attempted with explicit permissions. Here they're calling the user and password on the command line, at least what's being shown here. So again, you'll get a 4648, and this might have information that helps you build that timeline or get details to say, hey, this is definitely a living on the land technique versus something normally going on. When we look at identifying valid accounts and logins, a funny part is we put this together, and I appreciated this from CISA's report. If you're not using your Windows event logs, an attacker probably is already. And so in this case, from the CISA report, it's funny. They said the attacker actually called get event log security event instance ID 4624. They use those those event login logs to actually see, hey, who's signing in here? What accounts? What's the login type? And so again, I'm encouraging you to use these logs to help you on the defense side, because guess what? Attackers are using it. On the flip side of this too, this command 4624, 4625, really useful if you're looking for password stuffing. So again, say the attacker cracks the password before and now they're trying passwords across all systems. If they're successfully logging in, you'll get 4624s. If they're unsuccessful, I think that's the 4625. Maybe that's the logout. Again, we have another really good Tech Talk Tuesday. It's the one down on that bottom left, how to use PowerShell event logs when threat hunting. Definitely, actually, this one was for PowerShell. Yeah, no, and also, yeah, that's the thing. So for PowerShell too, the PowerShell event logs, right? So at the different state of a PowerShell script being run, there's 3 event logs. We'll talk the given specific numbers here in a slide or two, but if they're calling the command this way, well, you're also going to see that in the command, in the PowerShell logs. And so that's something you should definitely check, right? So, the thing that I'm pointing out here again is with living on the land, the good thing is if you know the event logs that roughly tie to the commands they're calling, they might not clean up every place, right? And so in this case, again, use your event logs because the attackers already are. So in looking for Volt Typhoon, kind of bringing it all to a close and saying, hey, how do I find something like Volt Typhoon on the network and on the host? In host data, right? Those security events, 4624 and 4625, looking at logins and logouts. Looking at login type, looking at the account name, when, where they're coming from, the host they're going to. All of that data is helpful. When you go into 4688 and 4689, this is one, again, not enabled by default like 4624 and 4625 is, but in those process start and end events, you get a copy of the command line. So if you're looking for, hey, how do I find that command line in that CISA report? If you enable these logs, you're actually going to get introspection into that command line, and you'll have data you can dig through as you're proactively or reactively working through it. The 4672, again, if they're using an admin level account, you'll see the elevation in those events around the time that they log in with that account. If they're on the command line using those explicit permissions or saying this username, this password, looking at those 4648s will help. From the PowerShell events, and this is the PowerShell equivalent to that 4688 and 4689. In the PowerShell event logs, there's an event called 400 and 403. This is the one that we've done that Tech Talk Tuesday deep dive on, so definitely check that out if you're interested. But when that PowerShell script starts and when it ends, the command line stored in there, the arguments, who called it, information on how it was called is all in there. This is one enabled by default. And so, again, if the attacker is using PowerShell, this is a really awesome way to look for, those PowerShell commands as they're being called. Depending on what that script does and what the attacker does, you also could look at PowerShell events 600, the providers. And so PowerShell's concepts of plugins, they have providers or includes. Depending on what providers they're using, you actually might be able to build a baseline to say, hey, it's really weird for you to pull in this one plugin, right? We don't see this one provider getting pulled in a bunch, right? So matching behaviors off of that is helpful. Now, something we wanted to point out as we go to the network side is, with some of the WMIC calls, you're going to see the login information via SMB and SMB2. Oftentimes that login, you can actually see the username and password because a lot of SMB connections, even if you're using SMB2 or higher, they're negotiated over SMB before they jump up. And so there's still some metadata before the SMB traffic gets encrypted. When it gets encrypted, when you get into command and control, the challenge is you might not see the contents of the packet. You might just see the SMB packets. But when those process call creates are being made, the WMIC ones, you're going to see the SMB packets. Again, you might not know exactly what they're calling. You might, if it's an older version of SMB or they're calling it a weird way. But again, this is where it's important not just to look at the network side, but also look at the host side. And then also on the network side, to that point of baselining, right? Looking at those proxy ports. Hey, this is going to a weird host. This is going to a weird port. It's a protocol I don't expect. Maybe something I extract out of the protocol looks a little weird. But, anytime those proxies are getting set up, there's going to be a baseline change roughly to it. I mean, they could try to hide and throw it over 443 and make sure it's HTTPS and try to blend in. But there's still going to be something weird in there. especially if it's HTTPS and they have a certificate, right? There's parts of the certificate you can latch onto. So, depending on how they're doing that proxying, there's a lot of ways to adapt it. Again, you want to look for those anomalies either in the network side or in the host side. So again, this was a quick dive into Volt Typhoon. We talked about the Microsoft report. We talked about the CISA report. We talked about some of the different living on the LAN tactics with Volt Typhoon and how to find them. And we talked network versus host logs, right? So hopefully this was helpful for you. We'd love to hear future topic ideas. So please share them in the box below. And we hope to see you back next week. Thanks for tuning in.